This is page 213. The directions for 7 through 12 read, write each percent as a fraction and as a decimal. So we're going to remind you what percent means. Percent means out of 100. So for just about all of these, the first strategy would be to take the percent, 72%, and write it as a fraction out of 100. And what I am going to do in every case is I'm going to ask myself, would that simplify? And it does. 72 and 100 share a factor of 4. If you divide 72 and 100 by 4, you're going to get, obviously the denominator is going to be 25, and the numerator, 74 divided by 100, is 18. You can look on a multiplication chart. 4 times 18 is 72. 72 over 100 is not really wrong, and the directions didn't really ask you to simplify, but I always do anyway. And the second answer is 0 and 72 hundredths. And if you're like, why is there two answers? Well, because we're supposed to do a fraction and a decimal. All right, so I just know 25%. You can write 25 over 100 if you want, but I have this one memorized. 25 over 100 simplifies to 1/4. And 25% means 25 in the hundredths place, so 0.25. 500%. Now this is the first one where we're going to get kind of a funny answer. Do you notice in our first two that we've got a percent that's under 100? 72% is under 100, 25% is under 100. This one's over 100. Well, every time what we do is we just take the number and we write it as our numerator, and we write 100 as our denominator. And so our fraction unsimplified is 500 1/100ths, which simplifies to just 5 whole, because 100 goes into 500 5 times. So the fraction actually just can be written as a whole number of 5. And what is this as a decimal? Well, 5 as a decimal would be just 5.0. And really, you could even ditch the 5.0. So the answer, I mean, really, it could be just a whole number. 500% is the same as 5 or 5.0. All right, what about 5%? Well, 5% means 5 out of 100. And that simplifies to 5 and 100 share a factor of 5. 5 goes into itself once, and 5 goes into 100 20 times, so it simplifies to 1/20th. And 5% means 0.05. This 5 right here needs to be in the hundredths place, because 5 out of 100 means 5%, 5 in the hundredths place. 37%, this is the only one out of these that wouldn't simplify, because 37 and 100 don't share a factor. And 0.37. That's the easiest one out of all of them. 165% improvement. This is going to be similar to what we did up on number 9, where we're going to have an improper fraction of 165. 165% means 165 1/100ths. We simplify by, well, we could actually rewrite it as a mixed number first. 1 and 65 hundredths. And then we're going to divide by 5. 65 and 100 each divisible by 5. And 65 divided by 5 is 13. And 100 divided by 5 is 20. So I get 1 and 13/20ths. And as a decimal, it's going to be, go back to this one right here. It's 165 hundredths, which means I have 65 in the hundredths place, but it's going to be over 1. I want you to notice something. Anytime we have a percent that's over 100, we're going to end up with a whole number when we do our either a whole number or a whole number with a decimal. So it's going to be 1 and 65 hundredths. All right, good job. Let's move on. Numbers 13 through 17 read, write each fraction as a decimal and as a percent. I'm going to need a little whiteboard for this. I might actually try to do all of 13, 14, and 15 on this whiteboard to show how they're similar, but in actuality, really to just show how they're different. So number 13 is 5/8. This is the fourth problem in this lesson where we have an eighth problem. And what we cannot do on this is we can't multiply 8 to just become 100. 8 is not a factor or a multiple of 100. So what we've done every time on the eighths is we divide our numerator by our denominator. And so I'm going to do 5 divided by 8, and that's going to end up looking like this. 8 goes into 5 0 times, but 8 goes into 50 6 times. 6 times 8 is 48. Subtract. and I have to annex zeros as long as I don't get 0 as a remainder. I'm going to divide until I get 0 as a remainder. 8 goes into 20 just twice. 2 times 8 is 16. 20 minus 16 is 4. Annex and drop a 0. 8 goes into 40 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40. I'm kind of done. Let's go back and read the directions real quick. We were to write each fraction as a decimal and as a percent. The decimal is 0.625. And we have to write that as a percent. Remember how we do this is we go back to our decimal and we place our decimal after the hundredths place, which means 62.5%. Not too complicated. The 8s are kind of hard, but we've now done 4 of them, so I think you should probably know how to do that. Number 14 is going to be a completely different strategy. Here's why. I'm going to just ask you a question, and this might prompt your thoughts. What does percent mean? Percent means literally out of 100. So our strategy should always be, can we take our current fraction and make it into 100? And in this case we can by dividing by 3. If you divide 300 by 3, you would get 100. So now we need to go divide our numerator, 258, by 3. 3 goes into 25 8 times, because 8 times 3 is 24. 25 minus 24 is 1. Bring down this 8. 3 goes into 18 6 times. 6 times 3 is 18. What's my answer? It's going to be 86 out of 100. Now that doesn't really answer our question because we're supposed to write that as a decimal and as a percent, but it gives us the information we need. 86 over 100 is 86 in the hundredths and 86%. All right, number 15 is going to be the most confusing looking problem, but it's going to be the easiest. Here's why. 350 out of 100. What does percent mean? It means out of 100. So if we already have a fraction out of 100, then our numerator is both the percent and the decimal. So the percent is going to be 350%. Now what's the decimal? Well, let's make this into a mixed number and then we'll figure out the decimal. How many times does 100 go into 350? 3, with 50 left over. 3 and 50 hundredths is the same as 3 and 5 tenths or 50 hundredths. It doesn't really matter. Both are correct. You could do 3.5 or you could do 3.50. Either way, you get the same answer. Okay, let's move on. Numbers 16 and 17 read, the poster shows how many of its games the football team has won so far. Express this information as a fraction, a percent, and a decimal. So we've got to come up with 3 answers. And the team has won 12 out of 15. So right off the bat, these words right here tell me how to set this up. 12 out of 15 means, I hope you're thinking, 12 out of 15 means 12 over 15. And so we've kind of answered one of the questions. We're supposed to do a fraction, a percent, and a decimal. We've kind of done the fraction part, but I like to simplify every time I can. And 12 and 15 share a factor of 3, so I'm going to divide those by 3. And I'm going to get 4/5. So my fraction answer is 4 out of 5. The team has won 4 out of its 5 games. 4 out of 5 games. Now I've got 2 more answers to do. I need to do its percent and I need to do its decimal. So how do I do this percent? Well, you may not recognize this, but I've asked you to memorize 4/5 before. What if you took a math quiz and you got 4 out of 5? What would that be? Well, I'm going to show you how to prove that. I'm going to take this number right here and I'm going to ask myself, what does percent mean? And I'm going to say percent means out of 100. I'm going to examine my numbers here and I'm going to ask, can I just make this become 100 by multiplying or dividing? And the answer is yes, I can multiply by 20. So if I do 5 times 20, I get 100. And if I do 4 times 20, I get 80. And what is 80 over 100? Well, it's 80%. And lastly, I'm supposed to write it as a decimal, and this written as a decimal would be an 80 in the hundredths place, 0.80. Now the more tiny bit proper way of writing that would be to, you don't need that 0. Just in algebra, we don't write zeros when we don't need them. So it's not technically wrong to write 0.80, but I'm just going to write 0.8. They're really the same thing. All right, let's check out number 17. It's going to be a very similar problem as number 16. They don't give us an image, but that's okay. Number 17 reads, Justine answered 68 questions correctly on an 80-question test. This was her score, 68 out of 80. Express this amount as a fraction, a percent, and a decimal. So if you remember back to what we did on number 16, we simplified right off the bat, and that's what we're going to do here. We're going to simplify to see if we can get a compatible number with 100. 80 doesn't go into 100 right now, and that's kind of the key with percents. Since 80 doesn't go into 100, we're going to try simplifying. So does 68 and 80 share factors? They do. And I'm just going to do this the easy way. I'm just going to divide by 2 and see what I get. If I divide these by 2, I get 34 out of 40. And that can simplify even more, so I'm going to divide by 2 again. Now I realize I could have just divided by 4 to begin with, but that's okay. 34 divided by 2 is 17, and 40 divided by 2 is 20. Now that's my simplified fraction. Remember, I have to do 3 things here. I have to write the fraction, the percent, and the decimal. My simplified fraction is 17/20. Now does that help me get my percent? It really does, because percent means out of 100. And can I make 20 become 100? I can, by multiplying by 5. So I'm going to multiply 17 by 5. 17 times 5 is 85. And 85 out of 100 is 85%. And that as a decimal is really simple. 85% means an 85 in the hundredths. Could prove either one of these by dividing. If you got 68 out of 80 on a math test, you would do 68 divided by 8, and you're going to get 0.85. So that just proves that what we just did is correct. All right, 2 more at the bottom, and these end up being just a little bit tricky, but I'll do my best to help you. It says each diagram is made of smaller identical pieces. Tell how many pieces you would shade to model the given percent. So what I do here is I need to recognize what 75% means. 75% means 75 hundredths, and 75 hundredths simplified would be 3/4. So we're going to shade 3/4 of these squares. We need to shade 3/4. Now there's different ways to do this. One way to do this would be to divide the whole thing into 4/4. So if I do this, there's 4 pieces, and there's 4 pieces, and there's 4 pieces, and there's 4 pieces. And it says I have to shade 3/4. Well, shading 3/4 would be like shade these 3, or shade these 4, and shade these 4, and shade these 4. So I've shaded this whole triangle, this whole triangle, and this whole triangle, and I left this one in the middle unshaded. It says tell how many pieces you would shade. Well, how many pieces did I shade? I shaded 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I shaded 12 pieces, and there were a total of 16. Which actually should make sense, because if you did 12 pieces out of 16, and you simplified that by 4, you would get 3/4, and 3/4 is equal to 75%. We're going to do something very similar for number 19 here. I'm going to change color though, just to be color coordinated. We're going to do 25% of these. 25% means 1/4, and this is a little bit harder to do 1/4 because I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares, and you can't really do 1/4 of 6. So what I can do then actually is I'm going to shade 1 out of every 4. Check this out. If I shade this one, that's 1 out of 4. If I shade this one, that's 1 out of 4. And if I shade this one, that's 1 out of 4. If I shade this one, that's 1 out of 4. So maybe I'll change color here and show you how I did 1 out of every 4. So look at my oranges here. Out of that square, there's 3 I didn't shade, and there's 1 I did shade. So if I go back to blue, I shaded 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I shaded 6 pieces. And if you think about that, it's going to be 6 out of 24. And 6 out of 24 simplified would be 1/4, and 1/4 is equal to 25%. Nice job. You are done with page 213.